Morning, everyone. Thank you. My name's Kelly, and I'm the grateful pastor here at Edges. I want to introduce you to one of our new plants. We should name her. I haven't yet, but you all can think about that. Today is the final week in the series that we're calling Perspectives. And as you know, this year we're thinking about our theme, which is to look out. We're asking ourselves, how can we be helped to do that? So today, outside in the foyer, there's a new corner full of these lovely plants, and they all have little papers in them. And it's because we're going to call this our Perspectives corner, and here are the instructions. Perspectives for when you don't have words and you need some, or for when you do have words that you want to give. Please take some words or leave some words for other people to enjoy and use. Now, we stole this from a bagel shop in town because it's really like sharing. Stealing really is just another word for sharing. And so I frequent this bagel shop often, where I often find words that are helpful. So it seemed like a great idea for us to consider when you have some words that you think would help shift someone else's perspective, then you can just write them on one of the little papers outside. Or when you need some words, you can see some that would be helpful to you and just take them with you. Put them in your book or on your bathroom mirror or wherever else would be helpful. We'll see how that makes its way around the community. And if you have a name for our plant, you can just put her name on a piece of paper, and that's how we'll know what to call her. This week, for me, was one of those kind of weeks that my grandmother would have called a pop your buttons kind of week. Do you know that phrase? I never know if this is like Texas colloquialism or if this is widespread. Do you know it or not? Yes or no? Oh. I think it's like when you get all puffed up with pride so much you're going to pop your buttons. That's where I think it comes from. Or you ate too much. But I think mostly it's like a pride thing. For me, this was one of those kind of weeks. I just felt so amazed by our church. On Monday, I learned of a need that a family in our church couldn't meet alone. And I knew we needed to meet it quickly. So on Tuesday, I just sat at my computer and typed the first few names I could think of. I sent a quick email to a few people who I thought might be able to help. On Wednesday, the day after I sent the email, 11 of those people showed up here in this building at 6 p.m. to go and meet the need, which was to do a move-out cleaning. Now, you know what those are, right? That's like lint from the last 45 years in somebody's house that you need to go and help clean out. And 11 of those people showed up to help a family whose name they didn't even know. It was completely disconnected from anything except that there was a need. So on Thursday morning, just feeling so overwhelmed by the gift that they had been to this particular family in our community, I asked them to reflect a little bit on their experience. I asked them just 3 good questions that I thought would help them to wonder to themselves why it had mattered. First, I asked them to reflect on why they said yes. One person said this: well, life throws things your way that you may or may not be ready for. Sometimes we can handle those things on our own, but sometimes we need help, and we have to learn that's okay. And then she said, and this is something I'm just starting to learn for myself. So helping somebody else helped her to be able to learn it in her own life. Another person said, well, honestly, I thought this was going to be a mild chore. But afterwards, what I would say is that it mattered. It mattered for the fellowship, and it mattered because I met people I didn't know. And then there was the feeling of doing something small but good. And none of these would have been a part of the evening if we hadn't had the invitation to serve. Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky, these are 2 authors who study and research leadership. They talk about this idea, about reflection, about the idea of stepping back from the action and asking ourselves, what's really going on here? Another way to think about it is to ask this question: what is it that we're doing while we're doing what we're doing? What is it that we're really doing while we're doing what we're doing, and they use this powerful imagery that I keep with me. The imagery they talk about, the metaphor, is about getting off the dance floor. If the dance floor is where you spend most of your life involved in the dance, it's about getting off the dance floor and going up to the balcony of your life in order to gain a different and helpful perspective. So reflection is what we're going to be thinking about together today, and about how reflection may shift our perspective, how actually it's something that God might use to help shift our perspectives. I'd like to ask what maybe seems like too simple of a question. What's so important about that? Why does reflection matter? I'm giving you a moment to reflect right now. Then I'd like to ask you for a few thimbleful-size responses. Why does it matter? What are some things you just say out loud, your first impressions? Why does reflection matter? You can see yourself. For evaluation. Sorry? Because you might want to make adjustment. Sure. And you can gain a different perspective. It can show you a path. Yeah.
Do I need to redo what I did?
It can help you ask, do I need to redo what I did? Or how to keep from doing what you just did. Excellent. Yeah. And something over here? That's so interesting. Someone said that in the first conversation too. Jake said you can use it as a time to ease your emotions, to not only be driven by emotion. This is a helpful thought. It's a pause that we don't often take. It seems, at least initially, like you all know that it matters. You found pretty easy responses to that. So then my next question would be, why do you think we don't do it very much? Why do you think we don't do it very much? I don't have that scheduled for an out loud question, but you're on such a roll. Seems like we should. Because we have a task list and it's time to move on to the next one. Yeah, I already can't do all the things I need to do. If I pause, I can't. Oh, we're scared about what we might find out about ourselves. And if you can't even bring that thought up to your conscious, then subconsciously you're doing that all the time, right? I don't want to know what I might find out. What else? We're afraid we might have to change our paradigm.
It's hard to know the benefit.
Yeah, it can be difficult to know what the benefit would be. Sure, especially on the front side of it. I wonder if reflecting on our living isn't very common, but I want us to know that it isn't a new trend. If we look closely, I think we can see that reflection has been God's idea all along. I'd like to just start for a moment in the very beginning of our human story. That story when God creates the first people, and those people who we've learned to call Adam and Eve live in a garden that is beautiful, where everything is easy and simple, until the day when they begin to make some of their own choices. And some of their choices get them into trouble. And so they try to hide from God, which is just funny if you think about it. To their surprise, which is also funny, God finds them. Have you ever thought about the first thing God does when God finds them after they've hidden? I want to invite you to go and look at it this week, because God invites them to reflect on their living. God invites them to go to the balcony of their lives, to step out of the dance of their own decisions and to see a different perspective. Genesis 3 is where you can find that story, and I think it's a model for the best end-of-day questions anyone could ever ask. Because in that story, God asks God's favorite people, which all of God's people are, where are you hiding? And then, who did you let define you? And then, what have you really been doing lately? Now, God already knows the answer to all of those questions, right? So is God asking for God's sake? I want to invite you again to read that story later this week on your own. It's homework, but I promise you'll find it fascinating. And if you do it, I'd like for you to ask yourself, what does reflection do for those first humans? You can see inside their story how reflection shifts their perspectives. Well, throughout Scripture, all of Scripture, not just the first Scriptures, one thing that keeps reverberating is God's invitation to people to go to the balcony and to reflect on their living. Today, I'd like us to look at one more, I think it's a riveting reflection story. It's in Joshua chapter 4, verses 1 through 7. I want to tell you a little bit about the story before we read it. Now, this is a story about how very long ago, God made a promise to lead God's people to a life of new possibility. Incidentally, that's still God's promise to all of us. God made a promise to lead God's people to a life of new possibility. Only this time, the people in this story would have to make a journey to a new place in order to be free. They had no idea how they would get there, so they had to learn something, and it was to trust God. This is a difficult thing for humans to learn. Well, they get to the climax of their journey. They come to this raging river, and there's no way they can cross the river on their own. So God steps in directly in this story. God parts the waters, and all the people get to cross the river. So what looks like a colossal dead end, have you ever been at that place in your own story? It looks like it's a colossal dead end, and all of a sudden it turns into a windfall. This is what happens for them. Now, I just gave you the recap because I don't want us to be confused by the details that show up in the story that you need to have the backstory in order to understand. But the part that we're going to pay attention to today is this reflection ritual that God sets up for God's people. And so we're going to start reading right after they've successfully crossed the river. Listen and see what happens. Joshua 4, verse 1. When the entire nation had finished crossing over the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Pick 12 men from the people, 1 man per tribe, and command them, pick up 12 stones from right here in the middle of the Jordan, where the feet of the priests have firmly been planted, and bring them across with you and put them down in the camp where you are staying tonight." So Joshua called for the 12 men he had appointed from the Israelites, 1 man per tribe, and Joshua said to them, "Cross over into the middle of that river, up to the Lord your God's chest. Each of you then lift a stone up on his shoulder to match the number of tribes of the Israelites. This will be a symbol among you. In the future, your children may ask, 'What do these stones mean to you?' And then you will tell them that the water of the Jordan was cut off before the Lord's covenant chest when it crossed over the Jordan. The water of the Jordan was actually cut off. These stones will be an enduring memorial for the Israelites." This time in this story, God sets up a whole reflection ritual. I'd like for us to ask together where we think this kind of ritual could be of any value for us. So the reflection ritual that God sets up is one where he's asking the people to go to their balcony, and he issues there are issued 3 invitations. The first invitation is to revisit it, to retrace your steps, to go right back where you just were, to revisit the moments in our lives, even to revisit the days in our lives, to revisit conversations, to revisit events, to revisit everything. To retrace our steps. They just crossed the Jordan, ready to move on to the next thing, but the invitation is, hold on, go right back where you just were. Go right back into the middle of that river. The second invitation is to mark it with meaning. To mark it, I would say, with its true meaning. In this story, God asked them to answer the question, what do these stones mean? What was I really doing while I was doing what I was doing? What did it mean, what just happened? What does it mean about me? What does it mean about God? And I would like to suggest that I think we do part of this ritual well, though warped. We're very good at being in moments and then asking what they mean, and they usually mean things like, I don't like those people. I just did that, and I realized I don't want to do that again. Or, I had this day today, and gosh, it seemed like it was so hard for her, so difficult for him. What was into him? What was up with her? We're pretty good at reflecting on what we want to infer about other people, aren't we? And then the third invitation that God issues is for them to share it with others. Do you see there where God says, people may ask you? And the invitation is to be ready to share our stories. Now, before we talk too much about all the things those may mean, I'd like for you to think about them together with a group. And the question I've lined up for us here is, why would God suggest that kind of balcony ritual? What's the value in revisiting our moments? What's the value in asking ourselves, what do they mean for us? What do they mean about who God is? What's the value then of sharing what's true? Sometimes in Edges we gather in groups because we get better things to think about that way. So I'd like to invite us to do that this morning. The way it works is you simply get with a group of 4 or 5 folks, talk about this question for 3 or 4 minutes. And I'm just looking out. I see there are many folks who are new in the room today. So those of you who aren't new, make sure new folks feel welcome, learn their names, and then just discuss where you're comfortable this question for about the next 3.5 minutes, and then I'll call you back. Ready? And go. about 30 seconds, everyone. All right. All right, all good reflections must come to an end. Awesome. Thanks for taking seriously what we can learn when we get together to talk about stuff. It really does matter. What the things we learn from God together and from each other are at least as powerful as anything that anyone would come prepared to say on a Sunday morning. So the question I have for you is, why would God suggest that kind of a balcony ritual? If you heard something in your group that you can bite-size for us in one sentence, what did you hear? Why do you think God might suggest that kind of a balcony ritual? God, that was worth a whole sermon in itself. Let me see if I can summarize. Braxton said sometimes when you revisit, you can get kind of stuck in a loop and you feel incapable of handling the loop that you're stuck in. That's why sharing it with the right people can help you to learn what actually can be learned from a moment. And Braxton just put an emphasis on the right people. You can't reshare things with enablers because then you stay in that enabling loop. But you can share with trusted people important things that can help you move forward and learn. Thanks. What else? Sorry? God knows we're forgetful. Sure. Yeah.
And then, that's always going to, have that, kind of memory. And I don't know,
yeah. The value for marking it at that moment for what it was at that moment and holding on to what that piece of it is for your life as well can be important. Sure. What else?
Reminding us of how far we've come.
Okay.
What our progress has been.
Yeah. Okay. So when we mark those kinds of moments, they can help us know how far we've come and what our progress has been, which can translate into helping us know where to head. Sure. What else?
Help you see the meaning in every moment. You might expect to reflect on Sunday morning, getting some deeper meaning that you wouldn't expect to reflect on your working hours and get a deeper meaning.
Yeah. Okay, so it can help you get deeper meaning in any moment. You might expect to reflect on something that we talk about here today because we practice it here together. But if you reflect on any moment, you might receive some deeper meaning that you wouldn't have had you not been able to reflect.
We talked about how we often maybe tend to reflect more on things that didn't go well or right, or things we did wrong, or things that we then proceed to beat ourselves up about. But that if we implemented a reflection ritual, we would also do that for things we do well, and that we could create a little more positive, dialogue to ourselves about what the good things that came out of it, or that kind of.
So Cassidy said sometimes we take up a reflection ritual pretty easily about the things that we didn't do well, that we want to beat ourselves up about, that we want to stay in that loop about. But if we implemented just the ritual about everything, then it could help us also to reflect on other kinds of moments as well. Sure. What else?
Sharing it with others could also mean supporting each other in similar situations and giving them hope that we will actually get through it.
Yeah.
There is life on the other side.
So sharing it with others, basically, and what Aaron said is the idea of a common story, that there will be things in our story that other people need to hear and things that other people have experienced that we may need to know, and that begin to build a common story together that we can share. Sure. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, it's very hard to see in the moment sometimes that God is with you, and when you look back, though, is sometimes the retrospection that you need to be able to see that God has been with you across. Well, guys, over and over again in scriptures, I'd even call it one of those big main threaded themes. God asks God's people to reflect. Who knew mindfulness was God's idea first? God asks Jonah, for example, to reflect with this question. Imagine God asking you this question: are you mad at me? You can find that if you read the book of Jonah. God asks Job to reflect in a book by that same name. Get this: do you trust me? Jesus asks Jesus' friends to reflect: who do other people say that I am? And then, who do you say that I am? What's the connection between what other people think and what you're going to think? All I can conclude is that God keeps bringing it up because it must be really hard to do this on our own. We must be good at forgetting. We need helpful reminders. Of course, looking back is hard because we're always in such a hurry to get to the next thing, as you said. And of course it's hard because it requires a shift from the details to the meaning of the details, which is hard. And sometimes we don't really like the meaning of the details, and so that can be hard too. But I wonder if the hardest part is not in that first invitation, the going back to the scene. I wonder if the hardest part is the last two or the next two invitations, the marking of our experiences with their true meaning and being willing to tell our story for what it really is. I wonder if the hardest part is both seeing that God is connected to my story and then finding the courage to talk about it. You see, our true stories, our big raging river moments, and our ordinary cleaning somebody's house moments, these can be deeply personal when we go up to our own balconies because they dig up stuff. They tell us things that are true about ourselves and things that are true about how we feel about God and what we know to be true. And putting those things into words can be both powerful and also quite vulnerable. And vulnerability, by definition, is uncomfortable. So the next time you think you're being vulnerable with somebody and you're not uncomfortable, it's something, but it's not vulnerability. Here's a case in point from when I asked the cleaners to reflect. You know, I told you I asked them on Thursday morning to reflect, and I didn't get very many responses. Why? Because it's hard to reflect. We're busy. We got stuff to do. We need to move on. I mean, there could be a million reasons why. I don't want to lay it on them what their reasons were, but that could be one of them. So I checked in again, and I said to them, I really need something for my sermon, so y'all better come through. That's not what I really said. No, I said, really, are you sure? Are you sure you wouldn't benefit? You know, just asked them 3 simple questions. And this is what they sent back. I'm quoting from one response. It's funny. I tried several times to write something up, see? It's too hard. And it always seemed to go down the rabbit hole of what I know to be true about me. It always seemed to go down the rabbit hole of how busy I was, how important every aspect of my life feels, and I'm already running so behind and doing so poorly. Reflection. But yet, when asked to do something that was truly a perceived need, I just prioritized it highest without a second thought. But when I tried writing that, it always came off as negative, like I was complaining about the life that I make choices about every day. It was an unwelcome reflection. And yet the point I'm really trying to make should be a very positive one about how important it is to say yes when those offers to help come along. Because it was this person's yes to say. It's not always everybody's yes to say. Some people couldn't do it this week. That's okay. And there would be healthy reflection about that too, right? Another person said, giving up the evening cost me the time I would have spent preparing for an interview or working on a project for school, or maybe just relaxing. All of those things I'm sure they needed, right? But, she said, I realized it felt like an invitation from God to help a family. And I realized I had a yes I could say to that. Which part is harder for you? Seeing that God wants to connect to your story, or wanting to talk about it? And what about when the story isn't quite as benign as a clean house? What about when it's not quite as victorious as crossing a raging river where everything turned out okay? What about revisiting and then marking the moment and then sharing the truth when the story is hard, or when it's embarrassing, or when it seems like it could ruin us? How do we talk about God then? How do we tell the truth about ourselves then? Once, a long time ago, I had a boss who I could not respect. My reasons were valid. I came to believe that the boss was unstable and toxic, as did some others. So in environments that seemed appropriate, I spoke about the problem, sometimes offering evidence. At first, I can tell you truthfully that this was all above board. But somewhere along the way, I crossed over into thinking I was better, which led me to arrogance and self-righteousness and scheming and self-promotion. What I did was true. It just wasn't right. Before I knew it, all of my environments became negative. And the story we all needed most wherever I went was whatever the latest gossip was. Whatever was proving the negative story. But it made me feel powerful and important. I was the center of most of the conversations. People came to me to talk about the problem. Just about the problem. We weren't really focused anymore on how we were going to fix it. We just liked to talk about the problem. When I finally got to the place about what was wrong all the time, this happened in a conversation that I was having where I was describing the boss again for about the millionth time. Toxic, careless with people, power hungry. And I realized I was describing myself. Now I want you to know that coming back from that dark place was a hell of a lot harder than getting into it. I had to correct the way I related. I had to say I was sorry. But what this really meant was that I was no longer the center of the gossip chain. The action was happening apart from me now, at first. And I looked like a hypocrite when I had to ask others to stop relating in ways that tanked other colleagues. I felt cheap. And the boss stayed in the picture. So I had to let go of the notion that I was the enforcer, that I was going to somehow self-righteously correct all of this. When I reflect on that story now, what I would tell you is that without God's help and healing in my own life, I would still be stuck because all of those things were not in me to do. All of them. To tell the whole story of what God does will mean telling the true story of who we are and where we've been. And sometimes it will be embarrassing. And sometimes you will worry it might change people's opinion of you. sometimes there will be pieces of it that aren't yet fully healed. Believing God acts on my behalf. Believing God is involved in or cares about, or that God wants to help shift and shape the direction and focus of the life otherwise controlled by me is critically important for building trust in God. Why do we need to mark that part? Why do we need to mark God's part in our story? Well, I wonder if God told Joshua to have the people set up the stones because he knew they would be tempted to take the part that they couldn't prove out of the story. Oh, we don't know how we got across that river. It was kind of big. I wonder if they would have looked in their rearview mirror and if they would have been tempted to give themselves full credit for crossing the river. Because if I do that in the story I just told you, I'm still in exactly the same place. But for the grace of God, there go I. I wonder if it would have seemed silly to tell other people that God did for them something that they could not do for themselves. I think believing God as a source in our stories may be less about having convincing proof and more about sharing our own experiential evidence. I wonder if that's how we believe. I wonder if we reflect on and then trust the answer to a simple question, a good reflection question. Could I have ended up in this spot on my own? Could I have gotten here if it was just me? What am I learning about me? What am I learning about God? Because you see, the closing passage in today's tale says that the story of the tale from today says that the story of the thing is the thing God will use to help all the peoples of the earth. Not the thing itself, but the story of it is what God's going to use. In verse 24 of that same chapter, this thing happened, so that all the earth's peoples might know that the Lord's power is great and that you may always revere the Lord your God. How are they going to know? How are all the people going to know? All the people weren't in the river. All the people are going to know because the story is going to carry. So the reflection, the ritual that God set up for them, it wasn't just for them. It wasn't just to help them trust God. It was going to be the story that other people would cling to. That's why it's so important. Because you see, there are people who are still standing on the banks of what looks like an impossible river. And to them, it feels like they're the only ones who've ever stood in that spot. It feels like they're the only ones who have a big raging river to cross. And your story could be the invitation they need to go up on their own balcony and to learn from their life and from yours about how it's possible to get across with God. The Joshua narrative promises that when we remember what God has done, when we set up stones and mark it, and then when we share it or tell about it, this little cycle is what will help us, verse 24, always revere the Lord our God. If I were to say that in Common Edge's terms, I would say reflecting helps us trust God. People often think stories with proof are what increases our faith, but I think it's stories of trust, not proof, that increase our faith. So let it be. Amen.